Hello all, I'm KelKidman and welcome to Breaking on the Daily, where today we're going to begin with some COVID updates. It's been a while since I've done one of these, or like a full sort of update like this, and so I wanted to start with sort of the panic that's been going on in much of the media, particularly CNN, with regard to the vaccine and the vaccine push, because you see, some of this has failed, and they are trying to push particularly vaccine passports more as an incentive to get a vaccine. And I say CNN specifically because I have a clip that was brought to my attention by KelKidman, which is just gloriously showing that they are just saying the quiet part out loud. Now, watch.
Clear to them that the vaccine is the ticket back to pre-pandemic life. And the window to do that is really narrowing. I mean, you were mentioning, Chris, about how all these states are reopening. They're reopening at 100%. And we have a very narrow window to tie reopening policy to vaccination status. Because otherwise, if everything is reopened, then what's the carrot going to be? How are we going to incentivize people to actually get the vaccine? So that's why I think the CDC and the Biden administration needs to come out a lot bolder and say, if you're vaccinated, you can do all these things. Here are all these freedoms that you have. Because otherwise, people are going to go out and enjoy these freedoms anyway.
That clip is just wonderful. I can't express enough how much I love this clip. There is so much here to appreciate. You see, they have said everything that I or many others would want to have the vaccine passport supporters say out loud. They have said so much to that effect. They are admitting that, well, the reason that we want this to happen is because, well, if we don't do this, and considering that many people are reopening, they'll just do it anyway. They'll just go out and use their freedoms anyway. They won't even get a vaccine passport. We have this small window of time to take this power, and that's when we have to do it. It is so wonderful that all of this is now being said right out in the open, because even though some people would be absolutely terrified at the sight of this particular segment, that they are saying all of this sort of stuff out loud, out in the open, overtly. They must have so much control over all of our power structures. I look and see the story within the story. Because you see, the story within the story in this case is that they are so scared of losing this chance, of losing the chance to do whatever they want, that they are willing to say it out loud, and they're getting sloppy. In a lot of cases, that is what's happening all across the political spectrum, all across whatever you might say the collectivist segment of the population are. They're all being extremely explicit about what they want and what they want to do, because they know one thing, and that is they are slipping from power. They are not regaining it. They are not gaining power. They are slipping in power. That is why they have this necessity, and that is why they've had to push back against all of the things that have been happening in many red states and even some blue states with the reopenings. There have been many examples of states reopening, the media going absolutely insane, and then nothing happening at all. Though, of course, there have also been other examples of states, and particularly court cases, that have not gone exactly to plan for these authoritarian collectivists. Because the Wisconsin Supreme Court has striked down the governor's, according to them, unlawful mask mandate, because their argument being that that the governor had the power to put up this mask mandate while he had emergency powers, but those emergency powers were only good for 60 days, and after that point, the legislator never renewed the emergency powers, thus meaning that any emergency powers mandates were stricken, essentially null and void. They had no legal backing. And this, of course, did not stop the governor from continuing to reinstate the mandate, even after the legislature explicitly revoked the mandate back in February, which is part of the reason for this suit, or I guess a part of the reason for this decision. And this has led to the Wisconsin Supreme Court declaring the mask mandate unlawful. This is very good, and it comes as a spearhead, sort of, as a continuation of the many court cases that have slowly but surely rolled back the COVID authoritarianism that has been that happened over the past year. This has slowly been happening, and it has many examples, many of which are occurring mostly stateside, as most of these orders are very luckily actually state mandates rather than federal ones, meaning we don't have to deal with the federal courts, we only have to deal with state ones. But it has led to a lot of good decisions coming through. There have been very little in terms of bad decisions coming out of the courts on the state side with regard to COVID authoritarianism. Well, a lot of good ones, really. It's happened slowly, of course, because that's the nature of our judicial system, but it is happening. And along with that, we also have updates on what is happening in the states where you might as well say the mask has been taken off, particularly in Texas, as it's been a month since the mask mandate has been removed in Texas. And, well, cases have continued to fall, with them being around half of what they were when the mask mandate was lifted. Back then, they were up at about 7,500-ish, and now they're down at about half, so around 3,500 to 4,000 is what we're talking about in terms of margin of error. I don't have the numbers directly in front of me, so forgive me on that front. But this runs afoul of the absolute media firestorm that was happening at the time. You even saw me cover part of the media firestorm. Of course, I could not cover it all, as it was just immense in terms of how many stories there were. But I did cover at least a bit all of the media hysteria that was going on with regard to this particular mask mandate revocation. And, well, it hasn't really gone well for the media, because they said this would be death and destruction. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse will show up, and revelation will come to pass, or whatever. I don't know exactly what they were doing. I just know it was an exaggeration. But it has been shown that this is not really the case. And this is why, if we're going back to the beginning of this segment, so many people are pushing as hard as they can for vaccine passports. Of course, a vaccine passport, in all likelihood, if instituted on a federal level, as Biden is actually looking into potentially doing, would be illegal, especially if it was mandated. And hopefully would be struck down in court by the Supreme Court or whoever else. Of course, you can't depend on that because our federal courts are kind of trashy, but certainly better than nothing, and knowing that it is in fact an illegal order is solace enough. Many people are not going to stand for this sort of thing, or at least I hope they won't. And the vaccine passports lose more and more efficacy as we see in places like Texas and in many places which have already shut down before we've even gotten to the major or complete vaccination trial. We don't even have access, and not everyone has access to vaccines, and that won't even happen until May. Of course, all the old people do, which is pretty much the only thing that matters. I'm, of course, not going to get the vaccine, mostly because of the idea of a vaccine passport. I simply refuse to support that sort of thing, and that's why I will not get a vaccine. But that's where it is. And the vaccine passports are really a long shot. Same goes with a lot of the sort of Great Reset sort of policy. A lot of that has gone by the wayside in the past few months because their window of opportunity has left them. They didn't have enough time to actually capitalize on the pandemic fears, in large part to do, and I'm going to give full credit to Donald Trump on this. A lot of this has to do with the fact that Donald Trump was in place, was not for the Great Reset, and did not put these or push these sort of policies through during 2020 when the actual pandemic fear was spreading like wildfire. The only time in which they even had a chance to get this sort of legislation through being now, and of course even that's a slim chance considering the fact that they have literally the slimmest Senate majority of all time, as in essentially none. Even now, they can't do it because the fear isn't there. The polling is not there. People are not going to be for vaccine mandates. They aren't going to be for vaccine passports or anything of the sort. The fear has already dissipated, if not entirely, at least to a significant enough of an extent to actually limit the ability of these sorts of things to be passed into law and thus become permanent. which is very good. It is very, very good. I don't want to understate that. But we have to move on, because we are sort of strapped for time in a lot of cases, to our next story, where we're going to be talking a bit about the Derek Chauvin trial, because a lot of things have been happening with regard to it, and I haven't talked about it a lot, because it is an ongoing trial, and a lot of things are going on, and it's hard to suss out exactly what's going on and where the trial's going, especially if you're like me and don't have any sort of legal expertise. My biases are obviously going to be deeply effective at skewing my perception of the trial. I think fully that Derek Chauvin is essentially innocent of almost all charges. I think the assault charge is fairly solid, though the manslaughter and murder charges seem to be weak at best, because to me it seems as though, from all the evidence I've seen, Derek Chauvin did not kill George Floyd. He was not involved in the death at all. That George Floyd, in fact, would have died regardless, because he had an overdose to the tune of around 3 to 4 times the lethal dose of fentanyl in his system. And this is official records. This is the official thing that is being put out by the state, by the prosecutors. So I don't see the argument for manslaughter, of course, and this is, in all likelihood, biasing my perceptions. But I can say that something that is not being biased by my perceptions anywhere near as much is this New York Times story, because they're asking, who are the jurors in the Derek Chauvin trial? Now, it's not exactly what you might think it is. Of course, they aren't actually doxing the Derek Chauvin jurors yet. Of course, they're only a few steps from that point, but this particular article is more about detailing the vague lives of who they are without actually getting into deeply personal details, talking about certain things that were said during the trial and the jury selection and all that sort of stuff with regard to the jury, how they might be biased for or against the police and whatnot, sort of the normal thing you'd expect from a jury analysis. But the headline, I don't think they were making a mistake there. I don't think that they just made it sound like they were trying to dox the jurors. I feel like they are about 1 or 2 steps away from actually attempting to do that, because the New York Times is a trash heap. It is not against doxing in these sorts of situations. It's done similar things with regard to, say, Nick Sandman, Covington Kids, and that sort of stuff. They're not ones to shy away from this sort of illicit behavior. So I'm not going to put it past them to say, oh no, they won't do that. And they're not the ones who would normally be pushing it as hard as certain other people in the press who are also kind of pushing that. People with more Antifa tendencies, people who are like, well, if they acquit, And they do have a worrying fear, because it's looking as if they may actually acquit, because not a lot has been going particularly well in the George Floyd case, the Derek Chauvin trial, with regard to the prosecution. A lot of things have been going wrong, actually. This, of course, has not prevented the media from trying to spin it as hard as possible to make it look as though conviction's happening. You can take this AP story, for example, where they talk all on and on about the witnesses. They were crying on stage. It's just trauma and grief and guilt. All of this sort of stuff. And, all of this sort of stuff to promote the prosecutor's narrative. But there have been a number of problems, particularly when the defense gets their hands on the witnesses. Because a few things have been revealed, and some of them have been revealed on Thursday, which is today for when I'm recording this. And one of them is that the girlfriend of George Floyd confirmed that both of them were in fact addicted to opioids and other things of the like. And not only that, it's also been revealed to us that he had an overdose back in March. Add this on top of the overdose he had in the context of a police situation in which he hid the drugs by eating them back in 2019, and you kind of have a pattern of behavior here. Back then in 2019, it almost killed him, sending him to the hospital for a few weeks and only being able to barely survive, essentially. Back in March, he also overdosed and had to go to the hospital. And in May, his friend that was in the car with him, one who was going to testify and be the voice of George Floyd, according to himself, of course, up until the point where he pled the fifth and fled for the hills, which was another update that happened today, which was a thing that happened. Up until that point, it was revealed that he is, in fact, their drug dealer. That he was the guy who was providing them with fentanyl and things of the like. That's pretty good for the defense's argument. That's all I'm going to say. Because I'm not going to make any assumptions about what is going to happen in this trial. Of course, you cannot tell until the jurors actually show up. The jurors are, of course, sequestered, especially in a trial of this nature that is so public and so covered in the media. They couldn't be, they are, of course, sequestered from media to prevent them from being as biased as possible. Of course, they are still biased. They have seen the media reports from the past year, so there's sort of that. But it seems, so it's hard to judge the jury's actual mood. Some people have said, well, the jury seems somewhat skeptical of the prosecution, but of course, I'm getting that through particular channels, and I'm not watching the trial all day, every day, because I don't want to deal with that. And once again, I'm not a legal expert, so I'm not trying to make any assumptions here, or I'm not trying to make any hard and fast predictions, because I frankly don't know, and I'm not going to claim to know when I don't, so there's that. But I do think that some things are skewing towards the defense, and it's skewing towards the defense's case, and this is one of those times, because this was one of the prosecution's star witnesses. This is one of their most important people. So it seems as though the defense has the prosecution on the back foot, at least from where I'm standing. Of course, once again, I could be wrong, but there's that. Moving on, though, to our last story, where we're going to be talking about a wonderful Los Angeles Times column, where California, they rush to vaccinate those poors, but what about the trannies? I am not kidding. That is a really close paraphrase of this story, and I could have put this back in the earlier segment, talking about all that sort of stuff, but I really wanted to cover this on its own, even though it is tangentially related through topic, because this article is... it's a trip. It really just shows the sort of mindset that a lot of these sorts of people have. Of course, it begins with the sort of fawning atmospherics that a lot of journalists and opinion editorial writers try to put into the beginning of their articles, with a vacuous first paragraph that doesn't give you any information, but tells you the state of mind they were in. It explains that this trans woman, he hates shots, he's 53 years old and whatever. He doesn't like it because the medical community, as a group, have always made things worse for trans girls, John said. So yeah, I certainly don't have any affection for the medical community. Yeah, I'm sure they don't. I'm sure you don't. They seem to deny your fantasies a lot more than they don't. Though, of course, when they don't, it's still too much. It is fascinating to see this article just break down how, well, the trans community isn't supported by the medical community wholesale, and California isn't giving enough subsidies and enough response for the trans community because they're focusing too much on the poors. Why aren't they giving so many subsidies to us, a smaller portion of the population? I don't think this author realizes quite just how many poor people are in California. It's an entire industry there to coddle the poors. So I'm not exactly surprised to see that, well, the people who spent the past 50 years coddling the poors, thus creating an entire whole community of garbage over in Los Angeles, are coddling the poors. I'm not surprised. A lot of these people, of course, are mentally ill on both sides. On both sides, okay? Both the poors and the transgender people. Some on both sides, there are mentally ill people. Of course, there are also people who are not mentally ill and just predatory, but we'll get beyond that. It is really... it's just... It also brings up certain statistics that are just completely taken out of context, like, well, LGBTQ people of color are twice as likely as white non-LGBTQ people to get COVID-19 during the fall, which is kind of similar to the simple black and white statistics that also exist, which show about the same in terms of an increase in COVID cases among the black community. It seems to most reasonable people that this has to do with vitamin D shortage, essentially. Or at least that's what has been proffered as an explanation for such. It's not a complete explanation, of course. But this article really represents, what it really represents, is the disconnect between many people on the LGBTQ and gender ideologue types, and all of those sorts of people, and the actually downtrodden people in the world. Many of these people that they're talking about are middle-class white people. Many of the people that they're talking about are people who do not lack for material wealth or anything of the sort, who could buy a vaccine perfectly well without any government subsidies whatsoever. But the reason that they want this sort of overarching help we might call it, subsidies for these people is not because they need it, or it's not because of anything that you would normally associate with charity or that sort of thing. The reason that they want it is because they want the collectivists. They want a collective solidarity, you might say. They want the collective of California, the state, to acknowledge the collective of the transgenders and acknowledge them as being important enough to give particular subsidies to, as opposed to people normally. They don't want to... this is, of course, a root of their collectivist ideology. All trans people are victims, not all poor people, because unless you're working class, and even then, that sort of thing is kind of going by the wayside in many intersectionalist types, this sort of class distinction. That's sort of going away. The idea that every poor person's a victim is not as popular nowadays as every trans person is a victim, or every black person is a victim, or every woman is a victim, or whatever it might be. They're more interested in those sorts of identities rather than class, even though poor people are objectively worse off than the trans community. The poor community is going to be inherently worse off than the trans community, because the poor community is based around the trait of being downtrodden, around the trait of not having wealth, of actually being in dire straits, in not being as well off as certain people in society, whereas the trans community is not based around that, which I think is important to mention. Though I think that's where I'm going to leave us off. And if you enjoyed this video today, do in fact subscribe down below. And if you go even further beyond that, you have links to all of my other platforms, well, most of my other platforms, which include places like BitChute, Minds, Odyssey, and the like, some of where I post my thoughts, and other places where I post my videos to better sites than YouTube. Of course, YouTube isn't down there because screw YouTube. And that's where I'm going to leave us off. I'm KelKidman, this has been Breaking on the Daily, and I'm out.